Welcome to the Imaginaries.
I am your unresolved feelings of sexual tension with turn-of-the-century splay-legged dinosaurs, Tony.
Hi, I'm the book that you bought right before immediately going to the library and checking out like 20 books, and you keep telling yourself that you'll justify the expense by reading that one book. But you haven't yet, and you probably never will, Kent.
So, why'd you have to call me out like that?
I know, it's too real.
Too much.
Maybe it's because I
true.
purchased like 5 books in February, and I only just started reading them, so calling myself out on that one too.
I still have several that I bought this year that I have not yet read, that I want to read because they, are potentially going to be some of the best of the year, but the library just asks for books back, and I have to do that.
I know, and deadlines are such a bitch, man. I mean, they completely upend my purchasing cycle. I would like to personally apologize to Sushin Liu, because Ball Lightning has been on my shelf. I purchased this a long time ago, and it's gorgeous, and I'm really looking forward to it, and I have been really looking forward to it for months, and I just library deadlines.
Anyway, so this now that we're done calling each other out, this episode is going to be all about the found family in science fiction.
Does that mean that you were calling me a
fantasy.
splay-legged dinosaur?
Long pause. Long
Crickets
pause.
chirping.
Anyway, so us splay-legged dinosaurs are going to talk about found families on this podcast.
Yes, we are.
And as per usual, I think it's useful to talk about at the top of the podcast proper what a found family is.
Yes,
so,
Tony, please keep that gate for me.
Actually, I was going to toss it over to you, and because I have some ideas, but I'm curious to know what your ideas are. Like, when you hear found family, or when you use found family to describe a work, like, what are you picturing?
Well, I mean, we're going to go back to, like, early childhood faves and whatnot a little bit later in the cast, but found families are, in my opinion, they're these, like, bands of brothers, bands of friends, bands of people who are only tangentially connected to each other, who coalesce over the course of a book. And this seems to, I mean, this is definitely not solely the province of science fiction. This is something that you can find in many other genres. However, in science fiction and fantasy, there is a preponderance of these groups that coalesce over the course of a book or a series, and therein, in that group dynamic, comes like a good part of the joy of the book and the dynamics between them, and also like a sense of meaning and belonging for the primary characters.
Cool.
How about for you?
So, we had this idea months ago. Like, we wanted to do an episode about found families. My hang-up is that I was waiting for the third book in Becky Chambers' Wayfarers series.
So your definition is tied up with one specific series?
Not necessarily, but of the recent books and shows and movies and comics and everything that I have looked at /read /consumed, Becky Chambers gets it best for me. She, and what really stands out to me is that those 3 books share a universe, but not characters. You get, like, it's the kind of some reminders of characters, some name check characters between books, but you get a whole new cast, essentially, with every story. And yet she manages to create newfound families every time. And I love that. And because they're also very new books, I think it's useful to mention that, if you want a particular example of the way that I use found families, I think that the 3 books in Becky Chambers' Wayfarers series, currently 3 books, probably more in the future, is an excellent place to start.
Well, and it's also worth noting that Becky Chambers' Wayfarer series is a great example, too, of how found families can exist in the fanverse as well as in the universes of the books themselves. The Wayfarers books were kind of, I don't know if you'd call it like a Kickstarter so much, but they have more of a fan drive than a lot of science fiction. And there's a lot more conversation coming from Becky Chambers and her conversations with other writers and her fans herself. That was a very complicated way of saying, essentially, that Becky Chambers has collected a community, a found family of her own around these books, in addition to writing them into the books themselves.
Mm-hmm. It's a meta-found family.
It's a meta-found.
Meta-found.
A found family of found families.
A found family
An extra found family.
But that definition, it's a useful reference, and probably I'll go back to it through this episode of the podcast, but that doesn't really tell you what I think of found families. So I like your definition. I think it's a good starting point, but I want to add to that, because I agree with it, but I want to add to it, is that I think there's something queer about found families. Because you could describe, basically, if you're just thinking about a group of people who don't really have a lot of attachments to each other, who somehow coalesce in particular space and time. I mean, that's coworkers, that's roommates, that's people who are on a bus,
Huck
maybe.
Finn. Yeah,
right.
It's like half of American literature right there.
Right.
Frontier
it's
stories.
So wide. So that the queer aspect really helps to turn it into a found family for me, because the way that I think of found families is that the people who are finding each other have that need. They've been cast out in some way. They've been expelled by an actual family. I'm doing air quotes here. Whether that's, people who they're related to by blood or society or, what have you. But they're the misfits. Somehow they're the misfits. And they found this new family who have likewise been cast out, who are misfits in their own ways, and those ways that are, not mainstream, not societally valid, not accepted by whatever you want to say, somehow unify this group of otherwise ununified people into something else, something more productive, something more than they were before. And for me, that's really the core of what a found family narrative is. You really have to have that, societal outsider kind of premise to the characters and why they're actually getting together. So the why of the found family matters as much as the what and the who, I think.
There's something there that wasn't there before. Yes, indeed.
Quite.
And I think that, especially as queer readers who have found families in the fandom and the genre itself, there's a particular importance to us. But I don't think that we are reading something into the genre that isn't already there, that isn't already a trend or a conversation that's already happening. So just it's worth acknowledging that we have a specific stake in this matter, but that we, objectively speaking, as objectively as we can be, think that this predates us. And one way we can kind of prove that is to look at some of the older found family narratives on our list, and which brings me to I feel like it's obligatory at this point, Tony, to have you open your remarks with Star Trek. So
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's a good example, because Star Trek is absolutely something I want to talk about here towards the beginning of the podcast, because even as I was putting our show notes together, I was like, the different Trek casts are good examples of found families. But as I was thinking more and more about it, I basically came to the decision that they aren't really. That Star Trek is made up of, with the possible exception of Discovery. And we're going to have to see how that continues to develop. But all of the other core series, they're not found families. They're groups of people who are very, very good at what they do. Who somehow have been promoted to and end up on, a really good ship. And I suppose now as I'm saying this holds true for the original Star Trek and for Next Generation, but there is still something of the found family in Deep Space Nine and of Voyager, because you have in Deep Space Nine and in Voyager characters who have been thrown together who didn't necessarily choose to be, where they are, who may have been cast out at some point. But in general, Trek kind of plays back and forth with the found family. So if we're taking, say, the Next Generation as an example, I don't think that's a found family.
Although there are definitely misfit characters. I mean, Picard himself is a maverick. Worf is a kind of an unusual specimen.
True.
Data is still trying to figure out who he is and how he relates to other people. So there are definitely elements, maybe you could call it a proto-found family narrative.
Right. Yeah, and I think that makes sense. And, you have to sort of think about it on the level of like the whole group and on the level of the individual, because I think you're absolutely right that if you kind of take the story of Data or of Worf and look at it, those characters with respect to their backgrounds, their cultures, their creators in Data's case, they are misfits. They have been cast out, and they found a group that they've coalesced with. But if you look at the group as a whole, like, they're on the Federation flagship. They're there because they're the most competent people in their respective fields. So is the whole a found family? I kind of think not. Are the pieces of found families? I would lean towards yes. So it's
headed in the
tricky.
Right direction.
Yeah, it's headed in the right direction. But if you were to compare it to something outside of the Trek universe, like, say, Firefly.
Yes.
Which,
by the way, I can't believe you didn't add this to the list.
I was doing it really quickly when I first took a look at it. I just didn't think about it.
Because I was like, I got to this list when it was halfway formed, and I was like, wait. Because the example of the found family narrative, in television at least, is Firefly.
Yes.
Yeah, so I totally agree with you that this is, I mean, you couldn't get a more misfit cast of misfits. And this operates on several levels. It operates on the, like, character level. It operates on the casting level. Like, all of the actors were kind of trying to find their place in Hollywood at the time. And then it also kind of happens on the show's production arc side of things. Like, this is a show that was in search of a home. This was a show that didn't quite get there, but then became a cult fan favorite. So I think that Firefly is one of the first examples of a fandom of being a found family itself, coalescing around a narrative about found families. Like, people identified with the show specifically because it was about this cast of misfits finding their family.
Yep, totally. And you could also, I think, have movement from, like, a non-found family into a found family. And I'll use another TV example here of Babylon 5, which started out in the first season or two with a group of people who, again, kind of like in Next Generation, were really good at what they did. Had been posted to this prestigious station, which was a core hub of, like, diplomacy, of trade, of hyperspace windows. I forget exactly how hyperspace works in Babylon 5, but by the end of season 2 and then into seasons 3 and 4, that societal backing kind of drops away, and that group of people who had already coalesced quite a bit suddenly find themselves being ostracized and being cast out. And so they draw others into their fan family, but they continue to coalesce around basically the ideals that they'd already had. They just had been accepted by society previously, and then they weren't. And I think that's a really interesting example of how to do a fan family.
And it's not alone in some of the details. I think too of Stargate, especially the Stargate SG-1, but I mean also Stargate Atlantis, which I didn't watch as frequently, so I can't speak to some of the spinoffs as much. But Stargate SG-1, I mean, it began as a movie that was kind of terrible and didn't really touch on any of the found family elements. But then the television show, which followed, really, really tapped into that, and it went hardcore at that sort of central tenet of found family narrative, and kind of eschewed all of the Lone Ranger-ishness of the original film. So you can definitely start from a place of not being a found family and get there, but often it requires significant structural changes to the medium itself.
Yes. So all of these examples so far, they've mostly been TV shows with the exception of Becky Chambers, but all of them have been about adults. And one of the things that really struck me as I was going back through this is that as I was pulling examples, the things that tended to occur to me most easily were things that I had come to as a kid. And that I count Star Trek in that too, because I watched Star Trek when I was, a lot younger. But they were series that...
Because you're so old now.
Well, when I was younger. Not when I was young.
When I was young.
When I was younger. But they were series that I remember, reading before, like, age 15, or at least starting before age 15. So I want to talk a little bit now about what it means to have a found family when you're looking at works that are more aimed at younger readers or younger watchers. So you had mentioned some favorite books from when you were a kid, or some favorite kids or YA books. So How about let's dive into that?
Sure. I mean, I mentioned in a recent podcast, the Religion podcast, as well as our Plus One at the University of Arizona, that I have this, fraught background, this very religious background. So a lot of the found family narratives that I came to when I was younger were like stamp of approval, religious fiction, or, at least were not religious or not atheistic in their approach to central plot elements, which is to say, some of the first books that I read that definitely tapped into the found family narrative were Bridge to Terabithia by Catherine Paterson and the Wrinkle in Time Quintet, I keep forgetting, by Madeleine L'Engle. And we did talk about Madeleine L'Engle in the first episode or something of
my
this
God,
podcast.
a long time ago.
Please do not listen to that podcast. It has
Don't.
terrible audio.
Yep.
But, we've talked about it at length on its own, but we didn't talk so much about the found family side of it. And
No.
especially as the books go on, but even from the very beginning, you have, again, maybe not like a perfect found family narrative or like a fully functional one, but you have elements falling into place. So Calvin finds his family in the first book. As the books go on, various other characters find their families too. And sometimes that means coming back to complete or find one's biological family, but often it's also finding a family that may not be related to you biologically or even specially, in the case of the misses,
Yeah, right.
And Bridge to Terabithia, again, like there's not like a complete erasure of like the biological family or the nuclear family structure, but there is this sense of like the kids are in it together and they become each other's families. And when one or other of those found family members is removed from the situation, that like completely upends the remaining characters' lives. And that's something that I think that kids can really empathize with. I don't know what your elementary and middle school experience was like, but I was bullied pretty severely. So when I found a friend, like I hung on to that friend. Those friends were more important to me in that emotional moment than my biological nuclear family. And so whenever I moved, whenever a friend betrayed me, you know how it happens, or whenever something else intervened to kind of break up that relationship, like it was a complete and utter devastation. I haven't felt that emotional intensity since I was young, and I think a lot of people do feel things more intensely when they're young, especially that need for belonging and the satisfaction that comes from finding that sense of belonging. So those two works really spoke to me when I was young. They're both not perfectly science fictional. They're also not perfectly found family narratives, but they gave me a platform from which to enjoy other more complex and nuanced stories as I grew up. How about you?
Well, I think that both of those examples, because A Wrinkle in Time was very much that way for me as well, and I think that what's going on there, what you highlighted so well, is really this idea in the found family narrative for kids or for young people that the biological family is not everything, and especially for kids that maybe grow up without a stronger sense of community outside of that, who may not know their neighbors, who may not make friends as easily, who may not have a lot of relationships in terms of extended family, cousins and aunts and uncles and those kind of things. That can be a really important lesson. Like books can be maybe their only source of people saying it's okay to find your family instead of only being born into your family, and that's who has to be most important. Not that all books are that sounds so subversive when I say it out loud, and which it can be and which it sometimes is, but really what I'm trying to say is not that it has to be 100% subversive, just that realization that the family does not, your family, your biological family does not occupy the most important level of any hierarchy you care to look at. It can be such a revelation for kids. That can also be a revelation for adults.
Well, it's not just it's not necessarily even like you have to reject one in order to have the other.
Right.
A lot
No,
of those
absolutely not. No.
child-driven found family narratives, they have both and. So like Wrinkle in
Right.
Time, Bridge to Terabithia, Families Present.
Yes. Right.
I even think of like the Ava DuVernay's adaptation of A Wrinkle in Time this year, which it really highlighted like the found aspects of the family as well as the rebuilding of the nuclear family. So it had both and I think too that there is something important about the interrelationship of the nuclear family narrative and the found family narrative. Like you think of Ian McDonald's Luna series. I mean, we can't talk about this series enough, but in this specific context, you have a very tight generational narrative that also includes these spin-off stories as each child of this family, what do you call it? Family dynasty spins off and discovers their people and where they belong. And that enables them to come back together or to relate better to each other as well. But it's like it's both and those stories, you don't have to divorce one from the other in order to get each.
Right. And I think that Harry Potter is actually a good example of this.
The Weasleys.
Right, exactly. I was thinking the Weasleys, like, because Ron is a really good bridge between, Harry, who is an orphan, and Hermione, who has parents who care about her but are not part of the wizarding world, and, his sprawling family, who all care very much about both Harry and Hermione and Ron. And so Ron gets to be basically part of this found family of other characters who've been cast out, and the part of his nuclear family, which is very supportive all the way through the series. And that's a really cool meshing of those two elements, and it happens to be in like a really, really, really popular series, so it's a good example of what we mean by that.
And damn, that makes me emotional just thinking about how that ends for all of them.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Thanks for making me cry. Okay, but yeah, so we've established that you can have both, which is good.
Absolutely. Yeah, but I've been really impressed with some of the media that's been aimed at younger people recently, like within the past 10 years, for the way that it's really masterfully handled that sort of found family and nuclear or biological family at the same time. I'm thinking here of both series set in the Avatar universe, Avatar and The Legend of Korra, as well as Steven Universe. Because in all of those series, you're dealing with characters who have varying degrees of connection to what you might call their biological family. In the Avatar series, Aang's all of Aang's people have been wiped out, but Katara and Sokka still have their father. Toph, her family is still alive. In Korra, we see Korra's parents. She interacts with them, and Asami has a really complicated relationship with her father. So you have, again, varying degrees of the characters being close to, far from, not being able to interact with their families or their societies, their peoples. And you get all of those mixed together. And some sort of family is found. That was very passive voice. You find a family somewhere in there between those characters, some of whom have connections to their nuclear biological family, some of whom don't. And that kind of really nuanced exploration of how to navigate that is so cool. And I wish that those had existed when I was a kid. Not that they didn't, not that like examples didn't, but I didn't have those when I was growing up, and I wish that I had.
Well, and one specific aspect we didn't have, even within those shows, but that was kind of launched by those shows, was the integration of the queer and the discovery of one's identity as a queer person, and also the discovery of one's found family. So, Korra and Asami, I mean. Yep. They never got to be canon on the show, but they get to be canon in the comics and in the broader universe, which is great. But like, I'm not in the show. I'm just going to groan about that. But I think that it provided a cultural touchstone for us to talk about both things in the same place, which is really great. And now we have works like Jacqueline Carey's Starless, which just goes like fully just fucking goes for it, man. And it's so beautiful.
Right.
It's like there is room for both in this conversation, and in fact, the found family narrative provides a very specific platform for talking about one's queer found family.
Yes, and I don't want to get away from that, because I think that that's something to really keep in the forefront of at least my vision of what a found family is. And I don't want to be a total downer here, but it feels like a lot of what I grew up with was the exploitation of this particular trope, of this, this queer group of people that, may not be queer if you're thinking about like sexual orientation or gender identity, but queer in some way, coalescing around, shared values, shared experiences or something. But the queerness, which could very reasonably be sexual orientation or gender identity, was kind of like erased out of that trope, so that we're only seeing it now added back in, where it was kind of like de-queered and then now it's being re-queered. I don't know that I'm making sense. Is that making sense? No, you're totally
making sense. And I think, it makes... You're making sense. It also makes sense that I wouldn't have encountered that as a young person because I was coming from a very specific background. I'm a little more surprised that there wasn't more queer found family-ish material out there for the general public that you might have stumbled across. Mm-hmm. I do think that things may have a slightly earlier start date than I know of. I know MTV was going at some things when
true.
I was definitely not watching closely in the 80s and 90s. But in general, I do think it's a tough question to ask. Did people deliberately exploit something that quote unquote belonged to the queer community? I don't know. However, the queer community needed that space and may have been denied it because of market forces and or censorship. Like it can even be as simple as ratings. So like if you had a queer relationship in a show or in a book, like that boosts your rating and makes you ineligible for certain primetime slots and things like that. So, there's a whole bunch of factors that play into it. I don't want to yell at anyone too loudly, but I do want to kind of bare my teeth and grimace at everybody.
Yeah, right. Well, let's look at some examples that are a little older, like, looking 60s, 70s, 80s. Because you had mentioned in our notes, and even into the 90s, like going back and looking at Sherry Tepper or Margaret Atwood, and back a little further, looking at the works of Ursula K. Le Guin, maybe of Joanna Russ, maybe even James Tiptree Jr., Alice
Sheldon.
Thank you. I was like, oh my god, I just suddenly forgot her last name.
It's only one of my major obsessions.
But, all of those authors were, especially if we're looking at, like, Joanna Russ, at Ursula K. Le Guin, when she was writing in the new wave of science fiction, when feminism and embodiedness were really coming into science fiction. I wonder if, we can trace some of the found family back to there. And so maybe, were those works maybe calling upon the queer in some way?
Well, they were definitely calling upon the what the fuck even am I right now in this writing space, because so many of these writers, Atwood's had quite a bit of longevity. Le Guin had quite a bit of longevity. Like they were still actively writing or are still actively writing in the case of Atwood in the late 2010s, but they were, they got their start earlier on. And those earlier feminist writers, or even writers like Tiptree Jr., Sheldon, who didn't define themselves as feminist writers, they really struggled to find their place, not just in the science fictional canon, but in the feminist canon. Because they were writing so early, there was no path. There was no voice for feminism in science fiction at that time. Yeah. And so, like, I'm drawing a little bit on the biography of James Tiptree Jr. that I read earlier this year, but, Alice Sheldon and Tiptree, like, struggled so hard to understand who they were in their personal life, as well as in the science fiction community, as well as in marriage. And so there was this great outcry against Tiptree, or around Tiptree's unveiling as Alice Sheldon, because a lot of the things that Tiptree had been writing were considered deeply masculine. And so to be revealed as a woman, it wasn't necessarily, oh, here's a woman who's a great female writer. It was, here's a woman who's been writing great masculine text. And Atwood, too, has come under fire for being a bad feminist at various points in her career. Le Guin has, too. That's addressed in the great new documentary about Le Guin. And so all of these writers had fraught relationships with feminism, but they were trying to figure out who they were. And I think that is a fundamentally queer question. Like, who am I? What is my identity? What is my relationship to my gender? And how the genre allows gender to express itself. I think that's lowercase maybe queer.
Yeah. So let's contrast that with some newer authors. So some authors who have come to prominence in the last 10 years or so. We have a pretty good list of authors who seem to be interested in creating found families, no matter what they're writing, whether those are books, or whether those are novels, novellas, short stories for TV, for not TV, for comics. Sorry, I didn't know how to phrase that.
Such a weird pause.
Obviously, Becky Chambers is going to be my go-to. But there are others that we like quite a lot.
Yes.
So who are some of your go-tos for the found family narrative?
I would throw Naomi Novik in there. Novik, of course, has written several of our recent faves, including Uprooted. What was Spinning Silver was this year's,
Spinning Silver,
right?
Yep.
And also the His Majesty's Dragon Temeraire series. I mean, you can't find a more found family narrative than Here is My Dragon, who is also my family, which is Novik's, sort of make and model. But also Sean and McGuire, who we talk about a lot on this show. The what's the series name for that one?
The Wayward Children.
I kept wanting to say Wayfarers again. The Wayward Children series. Nnedi Okorafor's Binti series, as well as the Akata series. Sarah Gailey's American Hippo duo. The list goes on. J.Y. Yang's Tensorit series. And one of the reasons I wanted to make sure to include J.Y. Yang is, they are writing as a #own voices queer author in this space. Some of the other authors are queer. Nicola Griffith, we could talk about, are definitely part of that community as well. But some of these authors may not specifically espouse queer identities on Twitter kind of a thing, but they're definitely incorporating that queer voice with a capital Q into their writing, which is just magnificent and couldn't have happened even 1 decade ago, I don't think. So it's great to contrast what was able to happen in the 60s, 70s, and 80s with what's possible now in the 2010s.
And what I want to note about basically all of those authors you just mentioned, Sean McGuire, Nnedi Okorafor, Sarah Gailey, and J.Y. Yang, came to most of those found family narratives by way of novellas.
Yeah.
Both Naomi Novik and Becky Chambers kind of had a more roundabout way getting to their found family novels. You already recounted how Becky Chambers got to it. I think Naomi Novik was she originally did fan fiction and then had a big following as a fan fiction writer.
Foundational to creating Archive of Our Own, which is sort of the online go-to place for there's a couple of great places to go for fan fiction, but Archive of Our Own really protects users' privacy rights and intellectual property rights, so it's a really special platform, and Novik was central to that development. So, they definitely all have these found families outside of the books that they're writing, too, just like we were talking about with Becky Chambers.
Right, and the other thing that I want to, commend each of them for is that we got those books kind of not by the standard, I don't know, they were originally publishing white cis guy science fiction in the engineering science fiction journals. That was a terrible way to put that.
I know who you're talking about right now.
Okay, I may be going to stop that thought because I don't know where it's going. So we're going to end with your thought on that thought. And comics. You mentioned a couple of comic creators, and I want to before you name check them, I want to throw in Lumberjanes, the series which I have recently been reading, and which is kind of currently my go-to for comic understanding of what a found family is.
And Noelle Stevenson, who is one of the sort of central cast of creators for that series, is definitely, again, a kind of a linchpin or a pivot on Twitter around which the community really gathers, the community of people who love original comics, who like to support the creators of those comics. But Noelle Stevenson, I would add to Noelle Stevenson and Lumberjanes, Lila Del Duca and Shudder, now Sleepless. Both of them are great found family narratives. Brian K. Vaughan has this huge staple of creations, but he's known for Why the Last Man, as well as for currently an ongoing Saga, which is a brilliant found family narrative in comic form. So, we've talked about Saga before. Saga was definitely one of our Imaginary Awards last year. These comic creators, especially the comic creators who have been drawn to Image Comics, which we've talked about before.
Yes.
There seems to be, again, you have have a conglomeration of queer creators. You have a conglomeration of creators who really want to support the intellectual property rights and creative potential of the creators. You know, those, it seems to be like a queer space with a lowercase q. Like there's room for queering the narrative there, and therefore for this found family stuff to kind of coalesce as well.
Yeah, and I think that is something that I, now that we're getting towards the end of this episode, am not going to let go of. Like, we're looking at what is, to me, become, and I would argue had been before, if not necessarily, you know, without a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Like, it wasn't acknowledgedly a queer thing. But now, a lot of found families are absolutely incorporating that queer aspect and doing it proudly. And, you know, even if the story itself is a bit of a downer and the characters have to, you know, get through a lot of shit, which obviously that's good, that's interesting, but there's still that, you know, the incorporation of explicitly queer characters, especially, and perhaps, well, no, I'm not going to qualify that, but that's an amazing thing to see. And I think that a lot of the reason why fan families are so, in my mind at least, is that I suddenly feel like I'm more represented by fan family narratives.
Well, and it can also take really weird and unusual forms. Like, I'm thinking here of Annalee Newitz's Autonomous and Martha Wells' Murderbot. Like, you have these characters who are not gendered specifically. They might be trying to figure out if they're gendered, but like they specifically are not gendered because they are synthetic. And yet there are definitely these found family arcs in their stories as well that are really rich and make room for, again, the queering of their identity in a really like unexpected and significant way. I really appreciate that you don't necessarily have to have explicitly capital Q queer characters in a book or a novel or a novella or short form, whatever kind of creation. You don't have to have explicitly capital Q queer characters in order to make room for discussions of identity and the queering of the found family.
So the very last question, sorry, pause. Time in again. So I want to talk about one more example before we get to the final question of this podcast. And that example is actually not an example of a found family, but rather how a found family does not coalesce, even though a lot of the things we've talked about in this podcast, explicitly queer characters being cast out, being, you know, whether that casting is societal or environmental in this case, and that's going to make sense in just a second. Isolation in some way. There is isolation going on there. All of that is true, but the found family never quite happens. And what I'm talking about is The Terror, the television series based on the novel by Dan Simmons. And I mentioned that because
things fucking fall apart, man.
Yeah, things go so terribly. But it's like, you know, the characters never kind of like make that family. Like, you have relationships between characters that they come in with, but it never actually turns into this communal unit that, you know, manages to see things through and survive. Which it's The Terror is also partially a historical novel, so you know, if you know the history, you know they can't survive. But
yeah,
also, I think
alert.
it's right. Well, I mean, you could look it up on Wikipedia and know that that happens.
The search for the Northwest Passage was fraught with many failures.
Yes, right, exactly. But I wanted to mention that because you don't always have to have a found family, and I would not exactly hold Dan Simmons up as, like, you know, a shining star of the queer community. I don't know that much about him, but he would not be my first choice.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be the central question of his books by any stretch of the imagination.
Right, no, not at all. But, you know, just the fact that we have sort of an exploration of what could be but wasn't, you know, that kind of puts the question in my mind, like, how might that look if it was handled by Becky Chambers or Sarah Gailey
Oh,
or
well, it
Shauna
would have been much
Maguire.
more funny if it had been.
Well, right,
But,
of course.
I mean, one of the great things about science fiction is that, and we talked about this before, is that it's made up of a collection of thought experiments.
Yeah.
And so in this case, you have, say, 2 or 20 thought experiments that have the same ingredients.
Right.
Difficult circumstances, misfit characters, some sort of external political pressure applied to the situation.
Yep.
That doesn't, I mean, it ends differently in each case. And that's the great thing about science fiction is, like, you don't have to follow the same arc as all of the other authors who are writing right now. And Dan Simmons is, I mean, he's still writing. He's contemporary with Shauna Maguire, with Becky Chambers, etc. But his books turn out so differently. And there's room for that in the genre. And so I think we're doing a favor for everyone, and this is part of the, like, breaking down gatekeeping thing, but by just allowing science fiction to not be a machine that you crank in the same requisite parts and out comes the same result. You know, I think in a sense it's a little bit more freeing of a genre to write in that sense than crime fiction. You go to crime fiction writing workshops and they are telling you how to follow the formula. And there are certain elements of a formula that you can follow to write science fiction, but you also really don't have to at all. And there's room for all approaches. And I think that that's the blessing of science fiction, to use my religious lingo. You know, it's the gift of it. It allows you to push your thought experiment to the ultimate end, but that ultimate end is going to be the product of your imagination, your quirky imagination, as much as it is a product of like the formula itself.
Yes, well said.
Thank you.
So that final question that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. So what was the first found family that you found yourself wanting to be a part of, and why?
Oh, I mean, I don't know. I mean, as a kid, you're pumped full of these found family narratives, right? Yeah. And they're not necessarily science fictional. And I'm thinking even of, like, Homeward Bound and The Goonies.
Oh, yeah.
There's a shit ton in children's television and children's movies and children's books. However, I would point to a collection of shows that I watched on television in Australia in the late 90s and early 2000s. And like, you're not going to know any of these. But if you grew up in Australia in this time frame, you'll understand when I start naming off Pirate Islands, Wicked Science, Cybergirl, Thunderdome. These are all the products of one man.
They're literally just like Mad Max movies.
They are. I mean, Thunderdome is Mad Max for kids. It's great. They're all terrible production value. They're all very low budget. They were all made by a gentleman named Jonathan M. Schiff, who's still making shows, by the way, for Australian television that then gets picked up by Nickelodeon. So, like, I think H2 or just Add Water and The Elephant Princess are all ones that, like, U.S. audiences might have seen. There's also a new one that's just aired in Australia that I'm really wanting to get my hands on called The Bureau of Magical Things. But, like, there's this whole generation of shows. Not all of them were Jonathan M. Schiff productions. There was Parallax. There was Guinevere Jones. There was this Canadian show I watched in Australia called 2030 CE. There were a whole bunch of these sort of science fictional, fantastical shows, mostly science fictional, though, that were geared and written for teens, like young teens. And that's, like, kind of a special space. Like, I think in the U.S. you had animated stuff like, Avatar: The Last Airbender that kind of filled the same space where they had sophisticated narratives that didn't insult teen audiences, but they also were, like, goofy and fun and, didn't really do anything too offensive for anybody. And these shows gave me an outlet. Like, they were goofy, they were fun, they got me more into science. They asked some nuanced and tough questions, but not so much that 12-year-old brain was overtaxed, you know. So you're not going to know any of those shows, but just suffice it to say that there was this collection of them that I discovered all roughly around the same time, and at the period of my life where I was just starting to ask questions about, like, this culture I came from, and who did I want to be, and what did I want to fall in love with, essentially, as a teenager. Yeah. You know, and again, like, you feel things so intensely when you're young, and I really empathized with these characters in these shows who like went off on adventures and were trying to figure out like what happened to my family, or what's going to happen to planet Earth that's been devastated, or how do I save this whale, or how do I mix chemicals in the laboratory and create wicked science? They were a lot of fun, but they were also just like a step above cartoon, which now that I've come back to the States, I realized that you had cartoons that were a step above cartoons. I didn't really know that as a teen, but that's a thing too. How about you?
Fair. Well, you've already heard me talk at length about Star Trek, and that you could literally just sum up my contribution to the podcast with that sentence. But Animorphs. I'm going to go back to Animorphs. Because Animorphs started to come out when I was in elementary school, so I think it hit me around like the 5th grade, maybe. And I just like it had that extra outsider-ness that similar series, both on TV and in books, really didn't have. Like, if you're to compare, say, Animorphs and Power Rangers, both of which were, right around the same time, give or take a few years, both of which starred casts of teenagers who needed to save the world, who had, who got these special powers in order to do so.
Stakes were high.
Right, stakes were high. But in Animorphs, it's really ultimately kind of a war story, and you get to see the horrors and the ravages of war through, kids who are between the ages of 13 and 16 over the course of the series. And in Power Rangers, it's all very, like, goofy and fun, and, like, they're all, still members of their families, and nothing really changes. And in Animorphs, over the course of the series, that eroded. Like, members of their families were killed or captured. Eventually, relationships broke down. And so that kind of, like, realistic portrayal of you can't have everything. Shit happens, and even when it's, like, really cool and you want to be a part of it, and, like, I liked Animorphs originally because I wanted to turn into animals and I liked aliens. But eventually, you get to the story behind the story and how war is hell, and it is degrading to everything that is human, or if you're thinking about aliens, it may not be human, but war is degrading to all values, perhaps is a better way to put that. And that really helped to like get at why I liked this group of characters, because I wanted to be friends with them, but as they became less likable and as more and more shit happened to them, I actually cared more about them because they were basically being continually cast out by these circumstances that they had to endure, and they had to rely upon each other even when those relationships started to break down. So,
well, and it's I think it's interesting to note too that like we go back and we excavate history for shows that maybe support our queerness now and our found family narrative and love for queering and found family narratives now. Like I think of how I discovered Roswell, the TV show in college. This is a show that aired between like 99 and 2002. It's older than Firefly. And it is definitely like an aliens found family narrative. And there is something about like the road trip with aliens that kind of seems to be part of the found family trope. But there's a lot of the items, whether they were books or comics or movies or television shows that made our list that I've come to like in my adulthood that maybe were created when I was a child or before I was a child, that now I can draw the lines or connect the dots between and make note of the found family narrative as like one of the attractive aspects of it.
Like, I honestly think Animorphs is a really good example of what you're saying too. And I think too, like there's a lot of books that maybe I read unthinkingly when I was in college or just before college. I'm thinking of like the whole dystopic young adult trend. So The Hunger Games, Divergent. Right. You could even add in like Ernest Cline's Ready Player One and so on and so forth to this list. But there's a lot of texts that maybe that wasn't the first thing that drew me to the story. But now that I look back at them, I'm like, oh, that appeals to me now. I can keep this in my life because of this reason.
And that is something that is like part of the underpinning to a lot of young adult literature right now, especially the dystopic stuff where you have people separated from their nuclear or biological families. In the case of the Hunger Games, violently so. In the case of Divergent, it becomes violently so over the course of the series. And Ready Player One, it's simply a byproduct of like the alienation created by the technologies through which people are interacting.
Right. Well, speaking of, some of the factors that go into the creation of a lot of successful fan family narratives, the societal pressure, the isolation, the exploitation, potentially, a lot of that goes into dystopian fiction, especially young adult dystopian fiction. So I think that's, a lot of whenever you're looking at a work of a YA dystopia, a lot of the necessary ingredients for a fan family are already there by virtue of it being a YA dystopia. So I think that's something that comes up a whole lot.
It's like the found family is the panspermia of science fiction. It's everywhere. It brings life wherever it goes.
Yeah. And speaking of young adults, I'm going to go ahead and give our listeners a little preview to what we have coming up next.
Yeah.
Our very next podcast is going to be about the legacy of Harry Potter to in both fantasy and young adult literatures. So we will have lots to say on that topic when you listen to us again in a week or so.
And we also have an upcoming interview with an author of young adult and junior fiction fantasy, Jesse Owen. So that's going to be something you can look forward to in the coming days. That's going to be a lot of fun. So
yeah, very much so. So stick around. And then can you, my dear, let our listeners know where to find us?
Yes, my dear. I totally can. You can find us online at our website, Imaginaries.net. Please do that. We try to keep that up to date with all of our latest episodes, as well as our reviews and so on and so forth. But if you want to interact with us and engage with our conversation, which we'd love to hear your input and your favorite found family narratives, you can hop on Twitter, and our Twitter handle is imaginary_pod. Tony's handle is deviance_engine. Mine is intrepid_Lee, L-Y. And you can also track down our past episodes, first of all, wherever you found this one, but we're on SoundCloud, iTunes, and YouTube for our backlist. So make sure to check out past episodes if this one has piqued your interest. And what else? What am I forgetting, Tony?
Oh, that's it. You got it all.
Right.
You got it all.
Boom.
Yeah.
We're there.
Yeah.
So, please drop us a line if we missed out. I mean, there's so many great found family
narratives. There's so many.
We have pages.
We have a huge list.
Pages of an itemized list. Thank you, Jim Hines. We didn't get to you. Thank you, Rachel Hartman. We didn't get to you. Cameron Hurley. Mary Robinette Coal. Ruthana Emrys. Danielle Clayton. Oh, my goodness. Octavia Butler. Sue Burke. Charlie Jean Anders. Again, Saladin Ahmed. There's Garth Nix, Nettie Corvor. The list goes on. So
the list goes on.
Yeah, we highly recommend checking out our episodes on our website because we do include some extra notes there. So look for the fun stuff, the extras, the goodies,
the goods
there. So yeah, Tony, you want to take us out?
All right. Well, we will see you. No, we won't. We won't. That's inaccurate. You will hear us next time.
Bye.
Bye.